Welcome to the Plant Fit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Dr. Frank Sabatino. Dr. Sabatino is currently the director of the Balance for Life retreat program in Deerfield Beach, Florida. Dr. Sabatino has also written numerous articles for magazines and journals in the areas of clinical nutrition, healthy weight loss, women's hormones, stress management, addiction, and healthy aging. We start the conversation with Dr. Sabatino sharing about what hormones are and their functions in the body. Enjoy the presentation.
Hormones are basically fairly large protein molecules that the body produces. They're genetically determined, so the gene pool has a code for making proteins, all proteins in the body, and especially hormones. And simply, they are just primary molecules that regulate function, meaning that they're proteins that will go to certain cells of the body. They'll attach to receptors on those cells, like a lock and a key. Think about a key going into a lock. And when they do, they signal cells, they activate cells to create and do certain functions. So they play a major regulatory function. So for example, let's take a hormone like insulin, which is one of the largest protein hormones in the body. When the pancreas, the organ that produces insulin, releases insulin into the bloodstream, and that's usually another definition of a hormone. They're chemicals that are released by cells and they circulate in the bloodstream. They circulate in our blood and they go to certain target cells. In this case, the insulin will go to cells of the liver and muscle. And on those cells, there'll be receptors, other proteins that match the shape of that hormone. So when they attach like a lock and a key, it sets up a number of signals in the cell. And in this case, when that happens, the cell will open up. The membrane of the cell will open up like a door once the key turns that lock, and sugar can enter those cells. So storage of sugar for this case and regulating blood sugar is going to be a byproduct of a hormone like insulin, for example. If you have other hormones that control the function of the thyroid gland and function of other glands and tissues of the body. So they're chemicals that regulate function, basically, very simply.
Perfect. If you were to give a rundown of what are the top functions that they regulate in our body, just so we get an understanding of how important hormones are.
If you really think about it, at the base of the brain, you have a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which releasing factors that triggers a major little gland called the pituitary gland, which is about the size of a thumbnail. And when that pituitary gland is stimulated, it releases hormones that stimulate everything from the function of the thyroid gland, function of the adrenal gland. So when we have to deal with stress, we're dealing with fight or flight. That's a hormonal control. When we're dealing with thyroid function, that's a hormonal control by the brain. Thyroid, it's called thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the thyroid. When you're dealing with stress, there's a hormone that stimulates the adrenal gland called adrenocorticotropic hormone. So everything from sexuality to stress to blood sugar regulation to metabolism, all of those functions, as widespread as they are, they're all regulated by specific protein hormones in the body.
That's fascinating. And we know nowadays a lot of people struggle with problems caused by imbalances, hormonal imbalances. What are some of the typical hormonal imbalances that you see? And maybe why are they so prevalent nowadays?
Well, it's very important to realize that when hormones are released in the body, many of the things that we do in terms of our lifestyle choices and activity can have an impact on those hormones. So for example, if you're sleep deprived, you're really creating sleep deficiency. It will aggravate the release of a hormone called cortisol from the adrenal gland that will increase ongoing stress in the body. So we see that a disturbance of sleep can affect a hormone balance that now relates to increasing inflammation. And that inflammation could damage the lining of your intestine. which could compromise how we digest food, how the bacteria in the body work, for example. Or if you're under a tremendous amount of stress, it may compromise another set of hormones. So for example, if you're eating too much saturated fat in your diet, like from animal products, it will interfere with insulin's ability to attach to muscle and liver cells, and sugar will not get into those cells comfortably. And now you'll have an elevation of sugar and you can produce diabetes or weight gain. So, we see so many situations in modern life where we're under so much pressure with stress, or we're finding people having a difficult time sleeping. There's so much insomnia from all the stimulants they're using, caffeine, nicotine, refined sugar, all of that. Or they're creating damage in the lining of their intestine, where now that barrier of your bowel is very tight. But if it gets irritated, it can open up and it can start to create an immune response. You start absorbing toxic material, and then you can create other changes where you now have autoimmune problems where the hormones are being aggravated. So for example, if you have an autoimmune disease where the body's reacting against itself, it may start attacking the proteins and hormones in the thyroid gland, and you may have an autoimmune thyroid problem. But a lot of these problems with hormones, these imbalances, are a byproduct of the fact that we're not eating well, we're overstressed, we're not sleeping as effectively as we can. So we've become kind of disengaged from the basic factors and needs of life, our biological requirements, because our modern culture drives us away from being in balance with those things. So we start eating poorly, we're not active enough, we're not doing enough physical activity, we're creating way too much stress. And all of those lifestyle factors will cause a disturbance in the body and the brain that upsets the hormonal balance of the body.
Yeah, that's fascinating. If we were to dive into specific foods and see how do they lead to either hormonal imbalances or how they could, as you mentioned, destroy some of the gut lining that we have. So if we were to single in on a few food groups that we typically see.
Let's take a good example, because right now a lot of people are aware that in the human body, you have about 10 times the number of bacteria and organisms than the cells that we have. We have about 10 trillion cells, but about 100 trillion organisms in the body, in the gut. In fact, 2 pounds of our body weight are probably just from the organisms in our intestine. So what happens is those organisms, when they're fed properly, and what I mean by that is when you're eating a very diverse plant-based diet with a lot of, high fiber plants, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, all those wonderful foods, we don't really digest the fiber effectively. So you would pose the question, how could a diet that is so good for us have things in it that we can't digest? Well, as it turns out, while we're getting the nutrients from those plants, the fiber is actually the food that our bacteria need to function effectively. So when they get that fiber, they can produce small little fatty chains called short chain fatty acids, just small pieces of fat that actually produce the mucus lining of our large intestine. And that lining is a very plush lining that protects the body from absorbing toxic material, dangerous bacteria. But if you have a lot of stress, for example, or you're eating very low fiber refined foods, let's take junk food and refined food and processed foods, you're not getting the fiber that those bacteria need. So you start to change the nature of that bacteria, and you start allowing bacteria that are more dangerous, more pathogenic to flourish. So they'll release toxic material. The lining of the bowel will begin to get damaged, and it will begin to open. It'll get what we call leaky gut. So from the refined diet, you can actually create a condition where the gut now has more openings, more holes to allow toxic material to seep through. And when it gets into the bloodstream, it can create damage and even autoimmune disturbances of the hormonal imbalance. So we could say the food group of refined processed food, which has become a big part of the eating plan of our population. When you're eating a lot of animal products, we just mentioned, you get a lot more saturated fat that comes into the diet. Saturated fat will block the ability of insulin to regulate blood sugar. So now you can create more weight problems. You can create diabetes if that goes on long enough. So the food groups of too much fat, refined sugar, animal proteins themselves will create a lot of acidity and inflammation. So that increase in inflammation and the increase in what we call free radicals, these little oxygen byproducts that are scavengers in the body, they create tissue damage. So they can create damage to joints, or they can block blood supply to the brain, creating something like Alzheimer's, or they can block blood supply to the heart, laying the groundwork for heart disease. So the large increase, the excesses of animal protein, saturated fats, and processed oils, and all of the refined sugars and things will create underlying conditions that directly affect the hormonal balance of the body.
That's fascinating. You mentioned earlier the thyroid gland. Can we talk about thyroid a little bit?
Yeah,
because a lot of people struggle with thyroid issues, and then they struggle to lose weight as a consequence. So if you were to explain what causes imbalances in the thyroid, and maybe also as a step, what people can do about it.
The thyroid gland is a major gland of metabolism, right? And it is controlled by, as I mentioned before, the hormones that the brain releases. So the brain releases hormones, they travel in the bloodstream, and when they get to the thyroid, they stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. And for the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones, it needs basically two things. It needs the amino acid called tyrosine, which is a building block of protein. It's an essential protein, a building block, and it requires the compound called iodine. Okay, so that when you put iodine together with tyrosine, you create what's called T3 and T4. These are the basic thyroid hormones that the body needs. The interesting thing about the thyroid is that it's a very big gland in relationship, as you mentioned, to metabolism. It helps us utilize calories, and it plays a role in regulating body temperature. So when you are literally really overstressed, or if you've used a lot of stimulant abuse, a lot of caffeine, nicotine, refined sugars, things of that nature, it causes a stimulation effect, but whatever goes up in the body has to come down with equal and opposite force. So a lot of stimulants by their nature reinforce hormonal depression. And from all of those stimulants, you start to cause the thyroid and the adrenal gland to both function at less than their full capacity. So so sleep deprivation, chronic stress, poor food choices will cause the thyroid gland to be depressed, and it will no longer be producing the hormones that you need effectively. If you're not eating good balanced diet with good adequate protein, good plant proteins, you're not going to get the tyrosine that you need. One of the things we see commonly in vegan populations too, or general population, there can be iodine deficiencies. So we find that when you have that, your thyroid gland will not function as well. So if you want to talk about what's going to help the thyroid work better, the bottom line is you're going to need to get adequate rest and sleep. You're going to need to get rid of all of those foods that are compromising the thyroid, all that processed junk food, all that stimulants, caffeine, nicotine, all of those stimulants need to be removed. And then you've got to make sure that they have adequate iodine, which in the vegan diet you can get from eating a little more seaweed, or you can do a little pinch of iodized salt, even if you just did a pinch that had just a little bit of iodine in it. But generally the symptoms of low thyroid are, as you mentioned, reactive weight gain. So if you find yourself, for example, eating fairly normally and fairly good, and you find weights coming on, there's a good chance the thyroid's not functioning as well as it should. We can measure that on blood tests too. You look at the stimulating hormone called TSH. The brain produces that. Routine blood tests can measure that. But one of the best ways to measure thyroid function, believe it or not, is to just take a thermometer. They're hard to find anymore because you can't use mercury, but they have a column thermometer that comes out of Germany that has a different substance that kind of works like mercury, but it's not toxic. If you shake the thermometer down below 97 degrees, and in the morning when you get up, before you go to urinate or even move, you take that thermometer and you stick it right in your armpit and hold it there for 10 seconds. That's called axillary temperature. If that temperature is below 97.8 degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit, or below 97, regardless of what the blood test says, you've got a low thyroid condition. So you can tell by the body temperature. So people with thyroid conditions not only gain weight easier, they tend to find out their hair is falling out easier. They tend to be more sensitive to cold and temperature change. So there's a few things like that that you can pick up, and it gives you an idea that there may be an underlying thyroid issue. But the truth is, many people are put on thyroid medication and they're put on hormones from the outside. The problem with and this is a very important piece, all of the hormonal systems in the human body work by something that is called negative feedback inhibition. That means if the brain is stimulating your thyroid to produce thyroid hormones, when those hormones are released, they go in your blood and they travel back to the brain, giving the brain the signal that enough is being made. So the brain will now stop stimulating the thyroid. But let's suppose you have a low thyroid. The brain's not getting that signal. So it's sending out a lot of stimulating hormone trying to compensate. If I put thyroid hormones into your body as a drug, as a pharmaceutical from the outside, your brain doesn't know that that's not coming from your thyroid. It thinks that that's coming from your thyroid, so it will shut the thyroid down. So the problem with taking hormones is it winds up becoming a life sentence. That's why if you go to a doctor and he recommends and prescribes thyroid medication and you ask him, Doc, how long will I be taking this? What's his answer? For life. Because in a way he knows that by giving that to you, it's going to shut your thyroid down. That's why before I put people on thyroid meds like that, I may make a very strong change with diet. We will work with a little bit of supplementation maybe. They may even do a short period of fasting to see if they can kind of revamp and reboot the function of that endocrine system. So you can approach it with diet, you can approach it with some supplementation, you can approach it by lifestyle habits to affect it. But once it occurs, it will take a while to recover. And the longer you take the medication that's given as a prescription, the less likely will you ever be to be able to be off of those medications. You will have to wind up taking it for life, pretty much. So it's a tricky thing with hormones because you get that feedback that's always going on. And every hormonal system works exactly the same way. If I put a hormone in from the outside, the body stops making its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's kind of scary to think, because you mentioned that the thyroid might shut itself off. And then how do you get it back online if you ever want to stop?
It never shuts itself off completely, but it can get to such a low level of function that you may have no choice but to take the hormone from the outside. Okay. And if that is truly the case, then I would be the first one to tell somebody to do that. Because at least, it is a hormonal replacement, and that to me is one of the things we can live with, because you can't live without a functioning thyroid. So if you can't get it to come back on its own, then you've got to put something in from the outside to support it. Sometimes the more natural forms of thyroid supplementation are helpful, though. So for the longest time, they would do something like Armor, which was derived from pigs. It was porcine thyroid. And it's a natural biological supplement rather than a synthetic thyroid hormone that's manufactured in the lab. Years ago, they would do that more. Most physicians today are not well versed in that. They just use the synthetics, whether it's Synthroid or thyroxine or any of that. But back in the day, they used to use Armor Thyroid and all of that. And sometimes the more natural biological forms, the body can handle a little better, and sometimes they can come off of a little bit easier. But you can do a routine screen for the thyroid in any blood test. I also recommend, when I do thyroid evaluations in the blood, not only to do the hormone from the brain called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, not only to do the hormones themselves, T3 and T4, but I also recommend measuring antibodies against the enzyme that makes the hormones in the body. They're called TPO, thyroid peroxidase. So when you take tyrosine and iodine in the presence of that enzyme, thyroid peroxidase, the body produces thyroid hormones. There's so much autoimmune disease now, we've talked about it because of the gut and the thing we mentioned, that the body could be attacking your own enzyme that makes those hormones. So you can do in the blood test, you can measure that. And when you have that condition is called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's a low thyroid function that's basically a kind of an autoimmune condition. But again, even that, with fasting and food and other things, sometimes can be reversed. But that's a trickier set of issues.
Yeah, you mentioned fasting as a tool to kickstart, hopefully, the recovery of the thyroid. How does that work?
Well, because if you think about it, if the thyroid is under functioning because of factors of overstimulation or poor food use, sometimes by putting the body in an absolute resting state, which is what we do when we fast people, and giving them nothing but water alone and letting the body go into a natural ketogenesis, it starts leaning on fat reserves to provide energy for itself. Under those amazing resting conditions, we see that the immune system can be rebooted. By the fourth day of fasting, there's actually a stem cell activation of new white blood cells, which are part of the immune system. So we see the fasting triggers that. It can bring balance to the function of certain organs. So sometimes the thyroid can recover by just giving it a profound period of rest and taking away all of the offending conditions that may have compromised it. So fasting can have an impact on helping to reestablish balance in the entire hormonal system, in the hormonal environment of the body.
That's fascinating. It's something you would recommend to do in which circumstances?
I recommend fasting when we're really dealing with more pathological conditions. But I will say this, that there are people that use fasting on maybe an annual basis, a week or so here or there, as a jumpstart to get their lifestyle on track. Or if they found that there's been so many things which have taken them off track, fasting can be a way to detoxify the body and get a jumpstart. So, for example, I've seen many times people when they're breaking addictions to food and things, going into a little fasting process just kind of changes the whole pattern. And it can kind of get you back on track. But the key to that is making sure that after the fast, you're following better lifestyle choices. You know, back in the past, many times people would say, well, I'm just going to live this debauched lifestyle a whole year, and then I'll just do my week of fasting, and then I'm cool. Doesn't really work that way. Fasting works best as a trigger, as a jumpstart to getting on a healthier path with your lifestyle and making food changes and lifestyle changes that can really benefit you. But fasting is a nice way to take a step back from the action, kind of go inside yourself, reassess things. It's a very introspective tool. It's a tool that really helps you to get more mindful about what's going on in your life if you use it that way. And so it can be a very valuable tool to help get that together, but also balance the hormonal system too.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that stress is a huge factor. And if we could dive into how stress impacts, let's say, the adrenal gland, maybe adrenal fatigue, and seeing what are the consequences of it, maybe beyond just feeling tired inside the body, maybe in terms of, does it trigger disease? Does it trigger certain dysfunctions?
That's a great discussion. When we talk about stress, it's a little bit of a confusing word in itself because it's a very abstract word. It means a lot of different things to different people. I mean, for example, there are good stresses where if I'm an athlete or I'm going to go on stage and perform, a certain amount of stress could motivate my performance. So that could have a positive connotation. But there can be other catastrophic events in our lives, or we can just have the gnawing, nagging situations of day-to-day relationships. So all of that comes under the umbrella of stress. But when we really think about stress, the way the body is designed, it was designed to handle traumatic and challenging events that it would encounter that could put it in jeopardy. So it has the ability, if I encounter a threatening circumstance or a challenge to me, I have the inborn ability to create a situation that allows me to do one of two things. I can either fight that situation head on, or the better option may be to just turn around and run away from it. So we call that the fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is the basic stress response of all living things, not just us. It's etched in everything with survival on this planet. But I think you can appreciate, or our audience can appreciate, that if you're going to fight or run away, the only way you can do that is if you get your nervous system and your muscular system involved. Because no matter what we experience, the only way we can act is through our nervous and muscular system. So in the fight or flight response, the body's devoted to the idea of getting as much blood and oxygen into those muscles in the shortest period of time. So the actions of fight or flight are, you get an increase in blood pressure. You can squeeze blood into those muscles. You get an increase in, pulse rate. That can go up. Pulsing, getting pressure moving through the system more quickly for a period of time. You'll have a shutdown of your digestive system, because when you're really concerned about your life and threat, you're not really interested in getting your next gourmet meal. The immune system actually will be suppressed because the body's trading off long-term protection for short-term survival. So we see a number of actions that take place in fight or flight. And as it turns out, those actions are being generated by the hormones and chemicals that are released by the adrenal gland in fight or flight stress. So when we encounter a stressful circumstance, it triggers a reaction in the body where information goes to the brain, and it will go into the hypothalamus where the releasing factors will go to direct the adrenal gland, but it will also go into other parts of the brain that signal fear and signal a whole mental construct for dealing with this event that we encountered. But the final pathway is that the brain will trigger the adrenal glands in this alarm phase to release cortisol and compounds like norepinephrine, noradrenaline. So they're things that now allow the body to create all the actions of fight or flight. So the muscles get tense, blood pressure goes up, our breathing gets shallow and rapid. Everything is ready to deal with that threatening event. So that's designed really, but for only a very short time, because it's supposed to be allowing us to deal with the event and then move on to our next challenge. But as it turns out, that response happens in 3 steps. There's that first alarm, and if we deal with the stress, it's over. But in modern times, we're no longer dealing with threatening tribes or animals. Our stresses have become not so much the acute situation that this system was designed for, but now it's a state of constant worry about what happened in the past, what may happen in the future. So we now take that natural response that we have, and we drive it into a chronic state of connection, so that, with all the abstractions of human communication, we're no longer effectively in present time. Most of us are worried about the future, concerned with the traumas of the past. So we become disengaged from the present moment, which is the only moment we really have to be effective. So what happens is that makes the stress much more chronic. So now we move from that alarm phase, where the adrenals are active and they're releasing hormone, into what's called a resistance phase, where we're now overstimulating the adrenals. And the interesting thing is, the adrenal glands, when they release cortisol, if they get overly stimulated, that cortisol has a natural affinity to lay down fat in our abdomen and our belly. So that belly fat that you see people have is a direct result of chronic stress. But if that stress continues and we don't resolve it and we don't deal with it, it's going to keep stimulating that adrenal system until it's like whipping a tired horse. It's going to become depressed. And now the body's going to be in a little bit of a compromise. So the body will now try to recruit other parts of your hormonal system, and it will start to recruit the thyroid gland. and it'll start to overstimulate the thyroid. And if that stress continues and keeps continuing, you're going to exhaust both the adrenal and the thyroid gland, and you're going to move into the third phase of stress, which is what we call exhaustion. And in the exhaustion phase, all the hormonal system now has become exhausted. So you're going to be putting on weight, you're going to be having a lot of changes in the body that make you a lot less healthy and a lot less efficient. And the only way to recover that is that you've got to somehow get rid and deal with that stress, what we'll call stress response management. And that's where people may actually do things like meditation and getting more rest and eating more healthfully and, changing and reframing their experience. So for example, when I encounter a stressful situation, there's really only two options. I either have to change the situation, or I have to change my relationship to the situation. I have to reframe it. I have to look at it in a different way. And that perception is a very big stress management tool because it helps us look at things a little bit differently so they don't have that negative impact. But that's how a stressful event, if it continues in our lives and stress becomes more chronic, will eventually suppress and reduce the function of glands like the thyroid and adrenal glands. And once that's happening, now you've got a whole series of other conditions in the body that will now develop with disease, more inflammation, more weight gain, and other things that are coming as a byproduct of that stress that weren't there to begin with, but because we didn't resolve it, we now got the entire hormonal system involved. It makes sense?
Absolutely. It's fascinating how it's a cascading effect almost.
And that's why we got to get rid of all stimulant abuse, because if you think about it, most people are on a roller coaster of stimulation and depression. What do we have? We have coffee, we have energy drinks. Instead of looking at our lives and realizing that we've got to kind of step back a little bit, we say, oh, I got no time on, and we're not even burning the candle out at both ends. We're cutting the candle in 3 or 4 places, and we're burning it out at 6, 8, and 10 ends. And we have, and again, we have the illusion that we're actually functioning when in fact all we're doing is reinforcing exhaustion and depression. And the endocrine system is suffering as a result, and we just keep pushing through. So it's no wonder why we have so much disease when we become so unconscious of what's actually going on, and we have this illusion of stimulation, not really seeing the underlying depression and collapse that's being created.
For the thyroid, you had shared which tests, which blood work to be done to find out if you are over or underperforming in hyperthyroid. Is there something similar you could do for the adrenal?
Yeah, adrenal tests can be done in saliva, and people have done this where they will literally do saliva tests, and the labs will send you a test tube, 4 test tubes with little cotton swabs that you just put in your mouth, and they'll do it like 8 in the morning, midday, evening, and right before bedtime. So they'll get, because with the adrenals, you really want to see a pattern of response across a day. All right. And you can do it in blood. There are 24-hour urine samples to look at cortisol release. There's different ways of doing that. But there are certain labs that will do this kind of testing in the saliva. And they'll look at, because when you wake up in the morning, the adrenal gland should be functioning at a high level. And when you're getting ready for bed in the normal cycle of the day, the adrenal should be winding down. Too many of us have reversed that cycle. We wake up in the morning and the adrenals are suppressed, and so you wake up tired, and then we're winding up at bedtime when we should be winding down to go to sleep. So we've done that with our lifestyle. The truth of the matter is we really are an animal that should be functioning with this idea of going to bed when it's dark and waking up when it's light, getting into that light-dark cycle. So the adrenals can be measured that way, but a good functional test for adrenals that's very simple is if you take blood pressure in 3 positions. So if you take blood pressure with somebody laying down, then you take it when they're sitting up, and then you take it when they're standing. Normally, when you go from laying to standing, gravity is going to be pulling kind of blood towards your feet. So there can be, the body has to compensate for that by keeping blood going to your brain by raising your blood pressure temporarily a few points when you change position. The adrenal gland is involved in some of that regulation. So if I change position from laying to standing and my blood pressure stays the same or goes down and does not go up in response to the gravitational pressure, that's another sign of a low thyroid function, low adrenal function. Mm-hmm. So just that simple blood test, a blood pressure test, can give you a little idea of how those adrenals are functioning.
That's fascinating.
I use that as a screen because sometimes you can't do the sophisticated blood work and the saliva test, and you have somebody in front of you and you can see the pattern is they're waking up in the morning tired, they have no energy during the day, they're getting cranked up at night. You notice that they're eating poorly. You have a good idea that the adrenals are not working effectively. This quick little blood pressure screen can give you some information.
That's fascinating, and thank you for sharing that.
Just like that axillary temperature with the thermometer for the thyroid, without going to do sophisticated testing, just looking at that body temperature, you get an idea of thyroid function. So that gives you a little idea.
Perfect. Given we were on the Plant Fit Summit, a lot of people are interested in exercise, and for men, testosterone is one of the hormones that are responsible. Exactly, right? So what works like against a good healthy testosterone level in terms of food, lifestyle choices? Does it come down to the same?
Yeah, look, understand this, all reproductive hormones, estrogen, testosterone, they're all typical what we call growth hormones. If you think about what happens when we move into puberty, things start to grow. In women, breasts develop, and estrogen kicks in. In men, testicles change. The different sexual things change. So the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and so on, are typical growth hormones. Now, as we get older, obviously, we don't need to grow as much. And we also find that growth hormones, when you stop growing, they will trigger abnormal growth of other cells if they're still at a very high level. So growth hormones can trigger cancer growth. And we find that as people get older, they're more prone to the cancer-causing effects of normal growth hormones like testosterone and estrogen. So what does the body do in its wisdom as we get older? It kind of reduces those a little bit. That's a natural development. So we come along and say, no, we're not going to accept that. We're going to just pump in testosterone back, and then you increase the risk of prostate cancer and other kinds of things. So by eating in the really high fiber plant-based way that we recommend, it really helps the body regulate those cycles, those hormonal cycles a lot better. And while there may be some little lower drop of testosterone, by doing weight training, by doing physical activity, by getting yourself in balance with these lifestyle factors, the body will have very adequate levels of testosterone for sexual function, even in men in their 70s and 80s, without worrying about it. Look at these blue zone cultures, these cultures where men and women live a very long time. They eat virtually a plant-based approach. They're very sexually active in very late years of their lives. Their hormonal levels are in pretty good balance, but they're very much in touch with the natural cycles that they live within. So rather than looking at testosterone as something that we got to keep replacing in men or estrogen in women, we need to stop seeing the little decline in those hormones as a disease process. It's not. It's a natural process of change. But as you mentioned, doing resistance training with weights, doing aerobic training, walking, running, biking, swimming, whatever, and doing that very routinely. I like people to get some form of activity, about 30 minutes, 5 to 6 times a week. That's 150 to 180 minutes a week. And I like to replace the concept of exercise, the word exercise, with activity. Find something you really, truly enjoy doing, because if you enjoy it, you'll continue to do it. I can tell someone to go to the gym and they say, oh, the doctor told me to go to the gym. They go to the gym in 2 days, they kind of like, I hate the gym. And they don't go back and do anything. So if you like walking, walk. You like dancing, dance. But try to get something going 4 to 5 times a week. And I would recommend for people as they get older to add resistance training, weight training to that, because there's a natural phenomenon that does happen with aging where there's a loss of muscle mass. We call that sarcopenia, the loss of muscle cells. And remember, muscles store energy. When insulin attaches to muscles, it drives sugar into those muscles. It stores it as a starch that we call glycogen. It's a storage form of sugar. So the muscles harbor energy. If you lose muscle mass, guess what? You lose the ability to store energy. So what happens to many people as they get older? They have this feeling of constantly being fatigued. And again, by reestablishing and enhancing that muscle mass with some additional weight training, you're getting an improvement. So for me, I like to teach what I call that triangle of fitness. The aerobic, walking, running, biking, the endurance stuff is at the base of my triangle. One leg of the triangle is resistance training. And I recommend people doing about 2 or 3 times a week, working the 8 major muscle groups of the body: chest, shoulders, arms, legs. And then the third leg is flexibility, because as we get older, everything seems to compress. That's why I like things like yoga and Tai Chi and things of that nature, because they're lengthening. They allow the body to have more youthful flexibility and lengthening. So if you do those 3 things, you're going to have activity as a major part of your lifestyle. And we do know that activity does many things. I just did a talk on the immune system, and it's remarkable how that low level, that level of activity, simple walking and so on, has a huge impact on balancing every aspect of our immune system, so that the cells that protect us against viral infection, which is a big deal right now, of course, across the world, a simple program of activity has an antiviral component. That's why while people are socially distancing and hunkering down, it's important for them to realize that they want to get at least a little bit of sun exposure and physical activity daily. We know that vitamin D from sunlight, as simple as that, is not just a vitamin. Vitamin D works like a major hormone in the body. It attaches to receptors on cells in the brain and also cells in the immune system, triggering an increased activity of our immune system to be able to get rid of viral infection. And vitamin D has a huge impact on reducing acute respiratory disease. And with this coronavirus, that's one of the major things that was making people hospitalized. The virus would attach to lung tissue. They would start coughing, they would start building fluid in the lungs, and some of them, if they were obese or had other health problems, would end up in an emergency room on a ventilator. Well, sunshine, activity dramatically decreases upper respiratory tract infections. So we need to understand that activity has huge impact on balancing, creating chemicals that balance mood. Probably one of the best antidepressants on the planet is just to move, far better than any of the antidepressant drugs. Regulating weight, reducing stress, helping our immune system. So exercise has huge value on a routine basis, and we need to be doing it.
That's fascinating. Like how quickly would those benefits kick in? Let's say I haven't been exercising. Is it something I can pick up really quickly, or is it?
The benefits will happen in days to weeks. It doesn't take that long. I mean, you got to realize if you've been really sedentary, yeah, it may take within a week or 2, but you're going to see benefits almost immediately in mood, and you're going to feel better. There's going to be a certain set of changes that go on relatively quickly. So, and I think that's an important question, because I think sometimes people feel that if they haven't been eating well or they haven't been living well, is it too late? You know what I'm saying? This idea, oh my God, I've been living this way for so many years. And I want to emphasize that reversal and beneficial changes happen within days to weeks. We have people come into centers that we work. We'll see blood pressure levels drop 20 points in a few days by people that just adopt a healthier lifestyle, like plant-based eating and moving a little bit more. Or we'll see changes in mood. They're able to be on less medication for depression and things of that nature in a matter of days to weeks. So I want to let people know that it's never too late, and it's certainly something you want to start whenever you can, because the benefits will happen relatively quickly.
That's good to know. Earlier you mentioned that you need adequate protein for healthy thyroid function. And a lot of people...
Well, what I meant is you need to make sure you're eating a broad base, so you're getting that tyrosine, that amino acid, and that's going to be in any basic... If I'm eating nuts, seeds, greens, all of the basic things that we eat in the plant-based world will provide all of that. But it is an essential amino acid that we can't make. We have to take it in the food that we're eating.
Yeah, perfect. That was my question: is where do we get it from? But you just answered that. That's perfect.
If you're eating a broad base of grains and legumes like lentils, beans, and you're eating a lot of greens, and you're even eating a wide range of potatoes, you're going to get all of those protein nutrients just fine. This idea that we all were brought up with, that you can only get protein from animal products and animal flesh, is just a bogus, very bogus argument. And like, I've been living this way almost 45 years. And so the last animal protein I had was in the 1970s, so it's silly. It's a silly argument, but you are going to get the broad base. And that's why, I like to recommend to people that when you're eating plant-based, make it a very diverse plant-based thing. Make sure you're eating potatoes and whole grains and legumes and greens and fruits. You want that full panorama of this wonderful bounty from nature,
That's good to know, and it's delicious too. So
no
one losing there. Yeah, perfect. To end of our interview, there's a lot of stress obviously going on right now with the pandemic. What would be your last words of hope or inspiration to people who are listening and maybe find themselves in some stressful situations where they feel a bit off balance? How can they get back on track?
Well, here's the thing. I think people need to really, when you listen to the narrative as it has been given to us by the media, you get this impression that you're just this thing in the center of the circle that's being impinged by viruses and things, and that you got no hope. It's all I've heard is fear and let's distance from everybody and make sure you're washing up. And the only hope is that we can quarantine and make sure that we're not exposed to this thing. The truth of the matter is we're exposed to bacteria and viruses every second of every day on an ongoing basis. There are at least 7 coronaviruses that we have encountered, and 4 of them are related to the common cold with very mild symptoms. But the truth that people need to understand is the power that is existing within them. The immune system is not some static thing that is subject to the whim of attack. It is a very dynamic, fluid system of cells that are not only recognizing things that come into us, but they're getting rid of them, they're digesting them, they're communicating them, they're even creating memory cells that are like software that memorizes what they've done. So if they get exposed in the future, they can respond to that. And we now know that all of the lifestyle factors of nutrition, activity, how we handle stress, all come into modeling and shaping how our immune system functions. So what I would recommend for people to think about is that when you adopt these healthy lifestyle choices of ongoing activity, getting that sun exposure that we've talked about, handling the stress of your lives a little bit more successfully, doing some meditation, doing some of that, take proactive steps, take positive proactive steps to realize that what you do has an impact of shaping the most powerful immune response that you can create. And stop worrying so much about organisms in the environment that are going to constantly be there, because we're going to be constantly dealing with bacteria and viruses. And for the most part, we're not sick because we have this incredible system within us, this immune system that's capable of protecting us. So do what you can to create a healthier lifestyle. And understand that when you're living plant-based, not only does it support, and living plant-based and getting sunshine and getting activity, not only does it support your immune system, but it also reverses and eliminates all those morbid conditions of high blood pressure and obesity and heart disease and so on that make the infection that much worse. So there's so much power that people have within their reach and within each daily choice that they make to give themselves a sense of hopefulness. And I want to really share that biology of hope, if there's anything I can share, and stop having people live in fear and understand that what they do routinely while they're practicing, supportive measures, sanitary measures, and even some distancing, understand the importance of normal, regular lifestyle choices for enhancing the most powerful immune system that you can muster.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Sabatino.
Toby, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I thank your viewers for participating with us.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.